My name is Detlef Schoen. I'm here to talk to you today about investment in regenerative agriculture. Before I do that, let me briefly introduce my company, NewAg Partners, a partnership set up a bit over 1 year ago, together with both high-level executive partners and a network of local asset managers in our various target geographies. Let me explain a bit about our mission, which then also leads directly into the theme of this brief presentation. I'm here to talk about next generation regenerative agriculture, more specifically, of course, investment in next generation regenerative agriculture. I'm extremely excited to be in the space at the time where we are today for a number of reasons. I've been around for almost 40 years now as initially agribusiness executive, a farmer, and more recently, since about 10 years, as an investment professional in agricultural investments. And never before have I seen such an alignment of stars, if you will, such a sort of coincidence of various factors. And let me start by giving you, a brief synopsis of what I believe are the three most important ones, and then spend a bit more time explaining, some more of the details. First of all, I think it's increasingly clear in everybody's mind that today's agriculture not only is a massive climate problem the way it is, it also has the potential to be a significant climate solution. Then, again, I think pretty much in everybody's mind there is an amazing array of technological solutions available today to help agriculture move into to a quite a different base from where it has been over the last 50 years. And again, I spent some time explaining that in a minute. Much less in the public mind and hardly discovered at all is what to me is the most significant macro factor impacting on this industry, which is the equity gap opening up in global agriculture as a result of essentially demographics in farming. And let me spend some more time explaining all that. Back to the climate situation. Today, agriculture and the food supply chain account for, and let me say, before I say any numbers, let me be very clear. This is all about dimensions. This is not about ultimate precision, but you get a fair idea about the dimension of the various issues I'm talking about. So agriculture today accounts for about 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Then again, half of that at least is upstream primary farming. The rest is the food supply chain. So obviously, addressing those greenhouse gas emissions, is in itself, of very high importance. What is intriguing and exciting is that whereas today's agriculture is what I call a toxic production system, the so-called green revolution has effectively reduced our soil to something like an hydroponic substrate, in the sense that you're pouring on nitrogen, fertilizer and other fertilizers, and you're replenishing whatever you remove by way of either emissions or harvesting of crops by, again, pouring on more of the same. And in the process of doing so, you kill off the soil biome, and you create an inert system of topsoil, whereas originally the soil is a living organism. And until reasonably recently, there hasn't just been enough scientific evidence to allow us to come up with a way of reversing this process and, if you will, rejuvenating the soil and put it in a position where it can live with a lot less chemical and pesticide and other input, And by doing so, and this is in the context of climate change, obviously the most important aspect, by doing so, sequester CO2. The good news, as you all know, is that agriculture is a process whereby you just use photosynthesis to produce, vegetation. Now, photosynthesis, of course, is the process whereby light and CO2 are combined with soil and water, and you have plant growth. Now, the CO2 aspect, of course, is what this is all about. And it is increasingly evident that whilst all other climate change related initiatives do nothing but slowing down the travel in the wrong direction, agriculture actually has the potential to reverse climate change, to draw down, to create a net drawdown of CO2 from the atmosphere and put it back where it originated, into the soil, specifically the topsoil. And again, we can revisit how that is happening a little bit later maybe. Technology was the next thing. What is available today is technology that allows the process of transforming the green revolution, toxic agriculture, into regenerative agriculture in such a short time frame and in such a way with such positive impacts on your total profitability that there really is no reason from a financial perspective not to do so, quite the opposite, again, to be revisited. And lastly, and here I probably need to spend a bit more time because this is so unknown. Lastly, there is the equity gap in agriculture. And as I'm addressing you as potential large-scale institutional investors, I think this is of the utmost importance. Agriculture today, and again, don't nail me down on the last digits, but in very rough terms, global agricultural assets have a value of, give and take, $10 trillion, US dollars. From an investor perspective, our view is that, at least initially, one should invest in countries and geographies and sectors where your money is safe. You are therefore traditionally an investment grade country where production costs are low, because at the end of the day it's all about de-risking the proposition, so therefore you need to be a low cost producer. And where you are a significant producer of food. Now if you then start with a world map of various low-cost production countries, not a lot of them are investment grade or otherwise acceptable from a political risk perspective. So if you create that overlay, you're ending up in the countries that we all tend to end up investing in, which are the US first and foremost, Canada of course, staying in America, the investment grade countries of South America such as Uruguay, Chile, and moving on to Australia, New Zealand, and then of course those parts of the European Union where you can make money without having to rely on subsidies, which in our view, and we use a heat map approach to sort of come up with these rankings, in our view you're ending up in Portugal, for permanent crops and horticulture, and you're ending up in pockets of Eastern Europe for row crops and to some degree livestock. Now if you take the asset value in those countries, you're talking about something like $6 trillion. Quite a bit of money. Now traditionally more than 98% of these farm assets were held by family farmers. And therefore, it was pretty irrelevant how big the target universe was. Institutional capital just didn't find a way to get into the game in this asset class, or what is going to be an asset class. That is going to change dramatically. The reason is that across all these countries, pretty much all OECD countries, or even, you could almost say globally, the average farmer is about getting close to 60 years of age. That in itself is probably not so exciting. Much more important is that not even half of every retiring farmer has a successor. So this has two implications. One, of course, that there is a lot of equity retiring from the industry, because that's traditionally how farmers sort of provide for their old age. They're being bought out by the next generation. So there's a lot of money leaving an already undercapitalized, grossly undercapitalized industry. At the same time, of course, farm sizes will statistically, on average, at least double. In some cases, some countries, treble, quadruple. So there's going to be an enormous growth for the next generation farmers. They need to farm larger farms with less money. So the equity gap has been analyzed more scientifically for Australia and New Zealand about 5 years ago by a local bank, and the number they came up with, depending on which scenario you were using, was anywhere between $500 billion and 1.3 trillion Australian dollars just for those geographies. The equity gap being defined as the difference between the equity available in the industry, the money that banks are willing to lend, and the money required to at least protect the status quo. Now, the equity gap as we see it in our target geographies, the countries I mentioned, is at least $1 trillion US dollars. And that's the amount of capital, institutional capital, initially, I think, from the private sector, but at some point also the public sector. Institutional capital that will be simply sucked into this industry, which means that anything of that size, by definition, will have to be regarded as an asset class sitting alongside real estate, infrastructure, and private credit as a sort of alternative asset class. Now, the importance here is if you take the demand for private capital that's opening up in agriculture over the next 10 years, very large scale demand of capital, with the need to transform and the ability to transform global agriculture from this sort of climate problem to the climate solution side, then to me that is exciting as anything I've ever seen. So let me explain a little bit about what I mean about regenerative agriculture. You can read up on this and you can spend hours and days reading about definitions. I mean, what it all comes down to in terms of what it means from a day-to-day farming perspective, it really means that you need to minimize your soil disturbance. You need to maximize crop diversity, which means longer rotations, get away from the corn, soybeans, or wheat, rapeseed rotations, longer rotations. You need to keep the soil covered at all time in order to prevent effective oxidation of carbon and therefore emission of CO2. You need to keep the root systems alive if possible at all, the whole year round. And again, wherever possible, you need to integrate livestock into your longer rotations to give the soil a breathing space. A couple of years of pasture make a hell of a difference, and also the manure and the way that livestock is activating the topsoil has a positive impact. But the key things are minimize soil disturbance, maximize crop diversity, and keep your soil covered. That in itself is already going a long way. You can then support that with technology. And obviously there is lots and lots of technology. So if you ask people about ag tech, what is ag tech, and give me a couple of examples of ag tech, you get, a myriad of definitions and answers. From my perspective, in the context of regenerative agriculture, or let's say also conventional agriculture, but certainly in the context of regenerative agriculture, what I think are the game-changing technologies are remote sensing. You can today identify problems in the making, whether it is a pest invasion, a fungus infection, whatever. You can spot it from the satellite image weeks before you can see it with the naked eye, which means that you can be surgically precise in the way you react to those problems before you have to then, in the traditional system, deploy a blanket spraying or blanket whatever reaction to specific diseases. So you can be preventive. This is like equivalent of preventive medicine. This normally comes and should come together with AI, artificial intelligence powered decision support. What this means, the combination of remote sensing and artificial intelligence, machine learning, decision support mechanisms is creating the equivalent of an autopilot. So you can have to, your satellite imagery is translated into an analysis, which then leads to, if you will, the system telling your tractor or whichever vehicle to pick up whatever piece of fertilizer or whatever piece of equipment and deploy it, as I say, very precisely. And the farmer can override the system, but he doesn't have to do all the worrying himself. I mean, that is the end game, which is probably a year or two away, but it's around the corner. So you have remote sensing combined with AI-powered decision support. And then, on the other hand, you have your very tangible soil enhancement and biostimulant products produced by technology, of course, but here we're talking about products. You have soil enhancers, like Novium is a good example. Turning lignite into the equivalent, the chemical equivalent, and the granularity of humus, i.e. taking coal and turning the clock back by 50 million years and converting it back to what it was 50 million years ago, which is a very powerful soil enhancer. You also have biostimulants, microalgae based or others, which do wonders in order to sort of boost the plant immune system below ground. So you have this enormous amount, billions and billions of organisms in a square or cubic meter of topsoil. So all these organisms, they are obviously interacting with one another, and you can stimulate, catalyze that interaction by providing soil enhancement and biostimulants. Taking all these things together means that it is today possible to take a tired, toxic, inert topsoil, which requires more and more fertilizer for the same amount of output. The incremental benefit of fertilization has been shrinking dramatically over the last 50 years. So you need more and more of the same poison, if you will, to create the same output. Now you can take that soil and detox it effectively by shifting to regenerative agriculture processes and systems and rotations, and supporting this with technology. At the end of this process, and this is interesting not only from an agronomic perspective, but certainly from a financial perspective. At the end of this process, you have a farm which has a higher diversity of crops, which is already contributing to de-risking the overall proposition. But you also have the same or higher yields as before. And probably most importantly, you have much less yield volatility, because you are more heat tolerant, you are more drought tolerant. So therefore, your yield swings from year to year are lower than the yield swings on your neighbor's farm who is farming conventionally. So that is improved. That in itself, if you define risk as volatility, then you have a less risky return profile, or in Wall Street speak, you have a better Sharpe ratio. So all of this means it's obvious that this is a thing to do. It takes you anywhere, and this is where technology helps, it takes you anywhere between 1 and 5 years to do this. Let's say on average it takes you 3 years. So there is a valley where your returns dip, there are opportunity and real costs. But once you climb out of that valley, you're ending up at a higher plateau, or at least at the same level, with an overall better proposition. Now, the obvious question is, why isn't everyone doing it? And the answer is because there is lack of capital. And here's where my story about the equity gap kicks in, because now we have the following situation. Let me give you a real life example which I've seen time and time again, and it is effectively the default situation for this next generation farmer. You have, call it old farmer Joe, who's retiring, and young farmer Jack is taking over the family farm. Joe's been running a very solidly financed, not utterly profitable, but robustly financed business, called it with a loan-to-value ratio of, say, 20%. By the time Jack has finished paying off mom and dad so they can retire, and brothers and sisters, his loan-to-value has shot up to, call it 60%. So effectively, he has become unbankable. That in itself is bad enough. Now, as we mentioned before, the farmer next door doesn't have a successor, and maybe even the farmer behind that farmer doesn't have a successor either. So here's this additional land for sale, and it's the most obvious thing to do to aggregate, the neighboring farm, because in this case, all that Jack has to do is buy, for example, just one more, say, combine harvester to farm, twice the size. So from a unit cost perspective, overall profitability, it's a no-brainer. It needs to happen. However, he's unbankable. And this is where the equity gap that I was mentioning, the $1 trillion plus equity gap, manifests itself. It's a series of these situations. And this is where private capital comes into play. And our role at NewAg Partners is to be the conduit, the facilitator, and the manager of these type of investments. So by far the most, in my view, least risky and most intelligent way of exploiting this opportunity set is to not buy these empty pieces of land left over by these retiring farmers and go and hunt for an army of farm managers which you then parachute onto these farms. They will always be outperformed by the locals. In that sense, it's important to remember, whilst farm investments are very much like real estate in the sense that most of your money goes into land and buildings, it is very much like private equity in the sense that a good farmer on a mediocre farm will always outperform the mediocre farmer on a good farm. So it is therefore important to identify the young next generation farmers that are in their top quartile peer group or better. So young Jack here is in that group. So what you then do, rather than, as I say, parachuting in, external managers, is to co-invest alongside Jack. And co-invest in most cases will be a majority co-investment. But it will be an investment which gives you the whole EBITDA, the whole farm EBITDA. It's not a passive investment. It is an owner-operator type of business model, but your day-to-day decisions are made by Jack on the farm, and all you need to do is to make sure that you have a business model that incentivizes him to get out of bed at 2 o'clock in the morning and to switch on the defrosting or whatever needs to be done. And there are, tried and tested ways of doing that. And by aggregating a number of these investments, majority co-investments, you get to scale. So the scale There's various levels of scale. There's the farm level scale, there's the aggregation level scale, and there's the portfolio scale. So look, at farm level, I mentioned the benefits of just adding one combine for twice the size. So that's obvious. At aggregation level, as you aggregate more farms in the same sector and region, you get benefits where you can procure jointly, where you can market and merchandise jointly, where you have, over central risk management, all the things that, companies such as ours will do on behalf of investors. What we also do, of course, on behalf of investors is to be that backseat driver. When Jack is, driving the farm, we are the backseat drivers. The difference between us and others probably is that we can take the wheel if things go wrong, because we are farmers. We can drive a combine and muster cattle and milk cows. So that is, I think, what is very important to bear in mind, that nothing is more dangerous than just reading up on, agriculture, which, after all, is a system with more variables than equations. So you need experience and you need to have been there and done it. But let me go back to the scale story. So you have that scale at farm level, scale at aggregation level. De-risking at the end is always about, in the farming environment, is always about decommoditizing. So the more you aggregate, the more critical mass you accumulate, which allows you then to not only horizontally aggregate, but also to vertically integrate. So the closer you get to the supermarket, of course, the lower your price volatility, and therefore the better your risk profile. So our proposal for institutional investors in agriculture is to be an owner-operator, not go home with a passive beta play investment, buying land and leasing it to farmers, which today, in our view, doesn't really compare favorably with, say, infrastructure or private debt investment. You can have a better return. You have the advantage that agriculture is producing a vital product. It is, we all need to eat. Therefore, a good enough farmer will always make money. Agriculture is inherently income producing, and agricultural assets are inherently appreciating, because every day we're losing plus or minus 100,000 acres to urbanization and erosion and various other things. And every day there's hundreds of thousands of people that we're adding to world population. So obviously there is a scarcity effect underpinning global farm values. So those two things are good enough reasons to invest in agriculture. Now, as you decide, therefore, to do so, invest in agriculture, our proposal would be to co-invest alongside young generation farmers, be a catalyst for change, create social benefit in these farming communities, because they now have the means to future-proof their business, to survive, as a farmer, and also to do what every farmer today would do anyway if he had the means to do so, which will be to transform his business from traditional, conventional, call it toxic, agriculture to a climate positive solution to world climate change, which is at the same time financially rewarding. So you have very attractive financial returns and you get the impact for free, which to me is as good as it gets.